Sour business. Sometimes a disagreement between two kids stay that way, just between the kids themselves. But the clash between Greg and Mara had always been right out in the open, and it had deep historical roots. Their wrangling had been noticed by their parents, by their neighbors, and by all their friends, and especially by every teacher who had ever had them in their classroom. Greg and Mara squabbled like cats and dogs all day long, always trying to outdo each other. My classroom's not big enough with those two around. That's how their first grade teacher, Miss Gibson, had described the situation. Mara and Greg are both so headstrong. They had a definite personality conflict. That's what their fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Haversock, had said about it. They are like positive and negative numbers, always trying to cancel each other out. That's how Mr. Xenotopoulos tried to explain it. Now that Greg and Mara were both in sixth grade, he was their math teacher. And as Greg himself stood there outside the music room on Thursday afternoon, holding an eensy-beensy book, his long, thin face drawn into a fierce scowl, how did he describe his problem with Mara? I hate her guts. Strong words. It was an expression Greg had picked up from watching old gangster movies. And it was also a stupid expression. Because Mara Shaw's guts had come walking down the hall. Greg wouldn't have recognized them. The truth is, all guts are pretty much alike. But Greg was not thinking logically at that moment. And saying that he hated Mara's guts did not feel like too strong a statement. If anything, it wasn't strong enough because, as far as Greg was concerned, Mara was no better than the common thief. She had always been a copycat, which would have been bad enough. Greg couldn't stand it when she tried to weasel in on his money-making ideas. Mara had been a brother for years. Mara had been a bother for years. And now this. Greg stuffed Mara's book into his pocket just as the bell rang. He ducked into the music room and sat down. Miss Chalmers immediately began playing scales on the piano, and the class began singing warm-up exercises. Greg had his mouth open, and his voice went, ah, ooh, along with the others. But Greg's mind was elsewhere. He had big plans for Chunky Comics, huge plans, and Mara was going to try to sell her stupid eensy-beensy books at school and try to steal his customers. Mara was going to eat into his profits, maybe even mess up everything. Something had to change, Mara to be exact, and she had to change right away, like today. But as Greg sifted through his past experiences with Mara, one particular incident jumped into mind, and it did not give him much reason to hope. Greg's first business outside his own home was a lemonade stand. He had sold his first cup of lemonade at the end of June during the summer after second grade, and he stuck with it every hot, sunny day all during July and August. The next summer he sold lemonade again, and his customers came back. The second summer he started using the honor system. People served themselves and just dropped quarters through a slot in the lid of a glass jar. That left Greg free to make money doing something like mowing a lawn at the same time. The first really hot day during the summer after fourth grade, he set up shop once more. His new sign announced Greg's ice cold lemonade, just 25 cents. Less than an hour later, the trouble began. Because there was Mara Shaw right across the street, setting up her own lemonade stand under a bright beach umbrella with a big sign. Mara's Tasty Lemonade, only 20 cents. All afternoon, Greg had watched helplessly. About half of his customers stopped and bought lemonade from Mara. 2 days later, on Saturday, it got hot again. And by noon, there was Mara, sitting under her umbrella, selling bargain lemonade. However, Greg had been thinking. He loaded an ice bucket and 2 jugs of lemonade onto a red wagon, and then he began pulling the wagon around the neighborhood, delivering cold cups of lemonade right into the sweaty hands of people who were outside mowing and trimming and working their gardens. Direct delivery was a great idea, and some people bought 2 or 3 refills. Greg was making good money. But 20 minutes later, there was Mara on the other side of the street, pulling a wagon, selling her lemonade exactly the same way. Greg had gotten furious. He looked both ways, and then he had marched across Maple Avenue and planted himself in front of Mara on the sidewalk. She pushed a few strands of damp yellow hair up off her forehead. She looked Greg right in the eye and said, "You're in my way." Greg shook his head. "No, you're in my way. You are the one who's stealing my customers and my ideas." Mara didn't blink. "I can sell lemonade if I want to. Anybody can. Like my mom. She sold lemonade when she was little. She told me so. And I can pull my wagon around anywhere I want." Then Mara had taken a step closer and put her freckled nose about 3 inches from Greg's, her eyes big and blue and absolutely fearless. "So get out of my way." Mara probably outweighed him by 15 pounds back then, and Greg hadn't wanted to have a shoving match. So he'd moved off the sidewalk. But as her wagon went by, he had kicked the back wheel and said, "Why don't you try coming up with an idea of your own?" Mara said, "Maybe I will," and she stuck out her tongue. "Yeah," said Greg. "Exactly. You don't even have a brain." "I do." "So prove it," said Greg. "Maybe I will," Mara said again. And Greg said, "I doubt it. Brainless." For about a week after that, Mara didn't show up on the lemonade trail, and Greg had thought, "I guess I told her." The weather stayed hot, and Greg had been making $2, sometimes $3 or $4 a day. Then one afternoon, he'd spotted Mara going from door to door around the neighborhood. She was wearing a yellow dress and white socks and little black shoes. And she was carrying something in a wooden picnic basket. Greg couldn't tell what Mara was selling, but he could see that money was changing hands. And he had watched for about 10 minutes, dying to know what she was up to. Finally, he couldn't stand it. Greg slipped out his side door, ran across the backyard, trotted down the alley, tiptoed between two houses, and hid in the bushes next to the Janison's front porch. He had waited almost 10 minutes, crouched in the scratchy hemlock branches, swatting at mosquitoes. Then Mara crossed the street and walked up to the Janison's front steps. Her feet on the wooden porch sounded like a bass drum. Greg heard the bell. Then little footsteps came running, and someone bumped into the storm door. Mara said, "Hi, Timmy. Is your mom home?" Timmy Jansen was about 3. After a long pause, he said, "She's my mom." Mara said, "Mm-hmm. Can you call your mommy for me?" Another pause. Timmy said, "She's my mommy." Mara laughed and said, "I know. So just turn around and shout, 'Mommy, someone's at the door.' You can do that, right? So call her. Go on, call her. Your mommy is at home, isn't she?" Another long pause. "She's my mommy." Mara gave up, and she called through the screen. Miss Jansen, it's me, Mara Shaw. Is anybody home?" Greg had heard bigger footsteps, and then, "Oh, hello, Mara. Don't you look pretty today? It's not Girl Scout cookie time, is it?" "No, I'm selling pot holders. I made them myself." Over in the bushes, Greg had almost burst out laughing. Pot holders. That is so dumb. Miss Jansen thought otherwise. "These are beautiful, Mara. So colorful. And you say you made them yourself?" "Mm-hmm." "Well, I want these two for myself. And these blue and pink ones will go perfectly in my sister's kitchen. How much are you charging?" $2 each." "Oh, a bargain. I'm going to buy an extra pair for myself." Greg heard Miss Jansen walk away. Come back, and open the storm door. And then Greg heard his favorite sound in all the world, the whisper of crisp bills as the money was counted out. Except the bills were being counted into Mara's open hand. Here's a 5, and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Would you mind taking 4 quarters? Not at all. Greg heard the coins. Then Miss Jansen had said, "And that makes $12. Mara said, "Thank you." "And thank you, Mara. We'll think of you every time we use these pot holders in the kitchen. Won't we, Timmy?" And Timmy said, "She's my mommy." Greg had heard enough. He slipped out of the bushes, scooted between the houses, and ran home. It was hot, so he'd gone to the refrigerator and poured himself a glass of leftover lemonade. It tasted sour. Greg remembered grabbing a pencil and a memo pad so he could do some calculating. If Mara had gone all around the neighborhood, and if every mom who was home had bought a couple of pot holders, then she might have made as much as $50 in one afternoon. $50. It was serious money. Then the doorbell had rang. had rung, and his mom had called from the basement, "Greg, would you see who's at the door?" It was Mara. She had smiled at Greg and said, "Hello, little boy. Is your mommy at home?" Greg glared at her. Then he grinned and said, "She's my mommy." Mara's blue eyes had gotten wide and then narrowed. She pointed an accusing finger and said, "You were spying on me over at the Jansens, weren't you?" Greg grinned. Grin got bigger. And again he'd said, "She's my mommy." Then, whoop, he'd slammed the door in Mara's face. It felt so good. The bell rang again, and as he opened the door, for the second time, Greg called over his shoulder, "Mom, there's something at the door. It's for you." Greg's mom had bustled into the front hallway. "Mara, I was hoping you'd be coming. Miss Altman called and said you were walking around selling the prettiest pot holders. I hope you have some nice ones left over for me." Greg had gone up about 4 steps on the front hall stairs and leaned against the banister so he could look over his mom's shoulder. There was a yellow cloth covering the bottom of the basket, and the pot holders were arranged so they looked like diamonds instead of squares. "These are lovely, Mara. How much do they cost?" Mara had hesitated half a second and then said, $3. "3," Greg said. "I thought they were $2 each." But Mara had held her ground. "I've only gotten 4 left, and these are my best ones. These are $3 each." Greg had known exactly what Mara was doing. She was raising her prices, trying to discover the most a customer would actually pay. It was a smart thing to do, something Greg would have done himself. And sure enough, his mom had said, "Only $3 for a beautiful handmade potholder? I'll take all 4 of them." And she had gotten to the she had to get her purse. Mara had known she had just won a battle. She had looked up at Greg, giving him a big smile, and said, "Still think I don't have a brain? I just made $12, another $12, right here at your house. Say, I'm thirsty." She had pulled a quarter from the pocket of her dress, and held it out to him. "Could you get me a cup of lemonade?" Greg curled up his lip and said, "I wouldn't give you..." But just then his mom came back. He hadn't finished that sentence. He turned around, stomped up the stairs, then down the hall to his bedroom, and slammed the door. Sitting there in his music room more than a year after the lemonade battles, Greg still remembered clearly what had happened next. He had walked over to his bedroom window and watched Mara walk across Maple Avenue to her front door, swinging her empty picnic basket as she pushed another $12 into her dress pocket. And he remembered thinking that making those pot holders and selling them to Mom had been a smart idea. And getting dressed up and putting that nice cloth in the bottom of the basket also smart. And Greg remembered that he'd had to admit that the girl he called brainless was actually a good thinker. Mara did have a brain, and not backing down when he had caught her charging $3 per potholder instead of two. That had taken some guts. And remembering that Mara had guts reminded Greg how much he hated them. Mara was a tough competitor, and in another 35 minutes, he'd see her because they were both in level 4 math. It was time for a showdown.